Hello everyone and welcome to our latest Critical Conversation event, which is the second event in a three-part mini-series, Engineering and a Just Transition to Net Zero. My name is Hayatun Sulam and I'm the CEO at the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering Foundation. And it is my great pleasure to be hosting another of these online fireside chats where we explore topical issues that are important for engineering and for society. This Net Zero mini-series of Critical Conversations is exploring how the transformations in engineering and technology that are going to be needed to decarbonise our society and economy will affect the lives of people both in the UK and beyond. In our first event, we focused on the energy system transformation, and today we'll be looking at transformations in our transport systems. And then in the final event, we'll discuss retrofitting the buildings that we occupy in our daily lives. This particular series of Critical Conversations is linked to a programme of work that the Academy is doing to better connect researchers and entrepreneurs with members of their local community to talk about the ways that engineering and technology can provide positive social impact. In the LinkedIn post for today's event, you can find our summary document on the conversations that we think that engineers and members of society need to have to ensure that our transition to net zero benefits everyone. So, as I said, today's conversation is all about transport and the scale of the change needed to decarbonise everyday personal mobility. We're going to explore the near-term changes needed to support sustainable transport. We're going to talk about the role of new technologies and the public's role in shaping them, as well as how we can build broad and inclusive visions for future mobility. We all know that how and when we travel is undoubtedly going to change, but what's essential is that we think through how we can harness the evolution of technology and changing in infrastructure to support a transition away from fossil fuels while providing accessible and healthy travel for everybody across society. And I'm absolutely delighted that we've got an excellent panel of experts today whose work and interests span the full breadth of these issues. So first of all, we have Professor Sarah Sharples, Chief Scientific Advisor for the Department for Transport in the UK. Sarah is a Professor of Human Factors at the Faculty of Engineering at the University of Nottingham and has led research in transport, manufacturing and healthcare, with a particular interest in designing systems that successfully integrate novel technologies and people in complex system settings such as rail, highways and aviation. Next, we have Dr. Jack Stilgoe, a Professor in Science and Technology Studies at University College London, where he researches the governance of emerging technologies. He's part of the UKRI Responsible AI Leadership Team, and he's worked with EPSLC and ESLC to develop a framework for responsible innovation that is now being used by the research councils. Amongst many publications, he is the author of Who's Driving Innovation and Experiment Earth, Responsible Innovation in Geoengineering. And finally, we have Professor Nick Tyler, who's the Chadwick Professor of Civil Engineering at UCL and the Director of the UCL Centre for Transport Studies. Drawing on his background as a musician, Nick combines highly diverse fields in his research and teaching, from science and engineering through to performing arts and policy. He's created a multi-scale, multi-sensory person, environment, activity research laboratory, Pearl to its friends, to study the interactions of environments, people and their activities, from axons and dendrites through to complex urban environments and vehicles. So we've got a great panel, but we would love you to get involved too. So please do drop your questions into the comments and we'll try and get through as many as possible as we go through the discussion. But I'm going to get the ball rolling by asking our panelists just a few introductory questions. And I'm going to start with you, Sarah. So in your role as Chief Scientific Advisor for the Department for Transport, you are really engaged in this process of the transition to low carbon mobility. What are some of the most pressing needs that you see from the policymaking perspective?
So thank you very much for the invitation to a conversation I'm really looking forward to. I'm just going to pull out three very brief examples. The first is one that we're probably all familiar with, the transition of automobile transport to electric transport and electric vehicles. We know that there are several elements to this rollout, the encouraging the adoption of electric vehicles from a personal choice point of view, but also making sure that the charging infrastructure is available, usable and accessible for all of those who need it. I would sort of typify this as being, we've sort of dealt with the early adopters now. We need to be moving on to the early majority and the late majority. So how do we really start to build the adoption of electric vehicles into the wider public? And then two other areas it's worth thinking about. It's not just about electrification. There are some parts of our transport system that are going to need alternative fuel solutions, and this is where the engineering community is so critical. And those fuel solutions are different for the different modes, whether it's aviation and the focus on sustainable aviation fuel, or maritime and some of the mix of different opportunities that we have there. And then finally, we also need to be thinking about active travel. We have an organisation called Active Travel England who has a target that 50% of journeys which are walked, wheeled, or cycled within our cities by 2030 will be conducted not using personal vehicles, but through personal active travel. At the moment, we're quite a long way off that goal. And so there, we not only need to think about the engineering infrastructure that might be able to encourage and make people feel safe as they are taking walked, wheeled, or cycled journeys, but also thinking about that behaviour change element.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a really good introductory framing. I'm sure we're going to dive further into some of those topics in the course of the discussion. But Jack, I'm going to turn to you now. And obviously, you are an expert in emerging technologies, evolving technologies, and how we can better involve society in decisions around those. In terms of future mobility, how can we best engage with wider society about what the changes that we're talking about here are going to entail and the role of technologies that can enable those changes?
Yeah, thanks, Hynton, and yeah, thank you for the opportunity to have this interesting conversation. Yeah, so as a social scientist, transport is a fascinating area for me because it's one of those areas where if you're an engineer or if you're a technology company, you're sort of acutely aware of your interface with society, and sometimes that relationship between technology and society is a little bit more distant, but transport, when it comes to transport, these are things that are bound up in people's everyday practices, their routines, their locations, their lifestyles, their identities, their sense of self, quite often. So any transitions, any disruptions need to account for and go with society, because we've seen, attempts to impose things upon society without consideration of the social factors can fail. It's sort of very easy, I think, to be seduced by some of the tech companies' stories in this area. They purvey this sort of magical thinking that says technology is going to change the world, right? We are going to electrify. We are going to change the way that we drive, and that will have radical, disruptive, and magical implications for how we live and how we get about, as well as all the benefits for the environment, for safety, and all sorts of other stuff. And the social scientists among us would make the rather important point, I think, that technologies don't just plug and play into the world, right? The world needs to do an awful lot of changing too. So Sarah's already mentioned charging networks, right? We realize the sociology of electric vehicles acutely, and there are, we understand pretty well the barriers to the adoption of that technology, even though that technology has advanced a huge amount in the last decade. So I think it's important to remember that basically the world needs to adapt to. The one other point I would say is we talk often about technologies as disruptive things. And I think social scientists would say, yes, there is a need to get us out of the habits, the infrastructures, the concrete that surrounds us, which locks us into various ways of life, which might be unsustainable. And in some cases, the technologies that we're being offered might not be disruptive enough. So one of the concerns about electric vehicles is that they substitute one means of driving a car from another means of driving a car, and you still have just as many cars on the road, right? Maybe what we actually need is radical forms of social disruption. So, anytime a tech company is trying to sell you disruption, I think it's important to ask, well, what sort of disruption? And actually, maybe it's about preserving the power and profits of incumbents.
Well, thank you very much for those reflections, Jack. And I do agree that there's something about the immediacy of transport to our daily lives as citizens. It means it's a really interesting place to explore the intersection between technology and society. And actually, I'm going to ask you, Nick, to build on really where Jack left off in talking about not just the changes that we're looking at in terms of today's mobility, but the opportunity to develop long-term, creative, potentially disruptive visions of futures for mobility that could look really different from the world that we're living in today. So how can we bring, those that are involved in the engineering technology behind that together with wider society, wider publics to co-create that vision? I know this is an area that you're passionate about and been involved in. Please do share some examples if you think they're relevant as well.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the opportunity, Ayrton. I think, yes, it's absolutely right. We need to get people much more involved, and that means actually creating a world in which they are able and feel able to contribute to these kind of discussions. And there is a bit of a risk that we kind of imply that it's all too complicated for ordinary people to get involved in, but actually it isn't that complicated really. And we should actually be working very hard with the community to create solutions that actually work for them. And maybe that is where the disruption lies. Instead of creating a transport system that works for the transport system, making one that actually really actively works for what people are looking for, maybe a little bit disruptive. And so we've been looking very hard at things like what we call co-cultivation rather than co-creation. So very much more based on the idea of preparing the ground before you plant the seed. So, and keeping that ongoing throughout the process. So you start very much earlier than you have a project, and you carry on much more into the future beyond the project. So you understand how people are interacting with it throughout the process. And we find when we do that, it becomes much easier to introduce technologies that might be more provocative for people, because they understand where it's coming from, and that technology is being provocative on their behalf rather than against them. So there's some very interesting kind of technologies of communication, of collaboration with the people in the community. I think that's really important. If we want to move to active travel, we actually have to realize that people don't just travel for the fun of it. They travel for lots of other reasons. And so active travel has to be kind of tied up with what people want to do. So if you want to go shopping, for example, then your shops have to be within an actively travelable distance, for example. So we might have to think about what we have around our communities and our societies in terms of the things that people want to do and where they are and when they are available, in order to be able to deliver the kind of active travel that Sarah was quite rightly talking about. I think it's not just enough to make the travel active. We have to get everything else active too. And so that bringing of things together is something which we haven't necessarily been as good at in the past as we should have been. And I think in the future, when we look into the future, we have to be much, much more integrated, not just within the transport system, but actually between the transport system and the rest of society. And that may involve all sorts of different kinds of technologies, both in terms of information, in terms of how we make decisions, understanding much, much more about how people make decisions, how they decide things. So that's why we are working with axons and dendrites, because we want to get underneath how their behavior starts. And so we can begin to understand how we can actually work with people in the way that they function.
Thank you, Nick. There's so much I'd love to dig into, but I'm going to just put that to one side for a second. And by the way, I love your co-cultivation notion. That's what I'll be taking away. I'd like to just go down to a little bit more detail in one example so that we can bring some of these things to life a bit. And Jack, I'm going to start with you because you've done a lot of work on the development and rollout of autonomous vehicles. And as a social scientist, I'd be really interested in your reflections on what we can learn from that might help us in the future to go about this in a more impactful way.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, the first thing I think it's important to note when it comes to self-driving vehicles is that there is something amazing going on, right? There is something happening on the streets of some US cities, some Chinese cities, to an extent, other places as well, where if you had shown somebody a car without anybody behind the steering wheel, moving around safely in traffic, in open-ended, complex environments, if you'd shown somebody that 20 years ago, they would have thought it was witchcraft, right? I mean, it's something totally amazing about that. And if I were an engineer, I would think it was just about the most interesting thing I could be working on, just because I think that the challenge is I mean, just fascinating. Does that tell you very much about their social value? Well, no, unfortunately, it doesn't. So there's still a huge amount to work out about, even if you can get the technology to work. And there's a big question about, you know, how we define adequate standards of efficacy and safety. What would that mean for society? What would the benefits be? Who would the beneficiaries be? I think is an absolutely crucial thing. At the moment, we are still in this sort of trap that I mentioned before, where we are letting ourselves get pushed around by the stories of some technology companies, and you know, governments, including actually the British government, where they have a really important role in articulating the values. So rather than just the technology push, it's about saying, well, what would we actually like to see from these technologies? You know, are we particularly interested in the safety benefits? Are we interested in the accessibility benefits? What about the sustainability benefits? And do self-driving vehicles offer anything there? So that we have a more sort of value embedded conversation about these new technologies. Otherwise, there's a danger that we let an engineering challenge define our future lives, right? And we get locked into a dependence on this new form of mobility that might actually not solve the problems that have been created with the old form of mobility. I'll just end by, so we recently did a big survey of the British public on attitudes to self-driving vehicles, and we found, I mean, perhaps unsurprisingly, a sort of substantial degree of skepticism. Robots on the roads, right? People have questions, but a lot of the most interesting questions are not to do with whether these things are safe or not, or how we prove whether these things are safe or not. It's about the sort of direction that the technology seems to be pointed in. So people are, at least in Britain, are more interested in things like self-driving vehicles for public transport than they are in self-driving vehicles for individual ownership, right? So they're interested in the sort of political economy of that technology, which suggests, you know, something closer to the sorts of visions that Sarah and Nick have been talking about.
Thank you, Jack. There's so many interesting points there. I'm going to pick up on a couple of them in a minute. I just want to remind our audience that we would really love to have your questions. Don't worry, I've got plenty of questions for our panel, but I would really love to hear from you to find out what you'd like to talk to the panel about. But first of all, Sarah, I think I can't resist coming to you off the back of Jack's comments around who benefits and the role of government in defining the values and the societal value that we want to be delivered through these technologies. So perhaps you could just say a bit about what government is doing to ensure that all groups in society benefit from these changes in mobility.
Yeah, and the first thing is, of course, we have a new government. Actually, I think last time I spoke at a Royal Academy of Engineering event, we were, it was before the election, and we weren't able to really sort of discuss some of the policy directions that might be coming. Well, now we can. And it's been really, really positive to hear the incoming Secretary of State, Louise Haigh, talk so boldly about inequality and the role of transport in tackling inequality. When she joined the department, she immediately set out 5 strategic priorities, and they included delivering greenest transport, improving performance on the railways, but they also included 3 priorities that I think are really pertinent to this question. Improving bus services and growing usage around the country, and of course buses are almost a ubiquitous public transport solution. Transforming infrastructure to work for the whole country, promoting social mobility and tackling regional inequality. And then finally, better integrating transport networks. And I think these 3 priorities really sort of speak to that societal benefit. we have lots of discussions within the Department for Transport about whether transport is an enabler or whether transport is something that we should be almost considering for the sake of itself. And I sit sort of halfway between those two sort of stalls, really. I think transport is an enabler to access to education, access to jobs, access to leisure activity, but well-designed transport can be an experience in itself. And it was interesting to hear Nick sort of talk about this. Yes, we do care about the purpose of our journeys, but we also care about the experience of our journeys. We don't mind a bit of a delay on the train if we're having a nice conversation with our friends, if we've got power for our work that we're doing on the train. If I'm walking into my local area and I bump into people who I know on that journey, that sort of brightens up my day as well as gets me there efficiently and contributes to my health. So I think that having a Secretary of State having this bold commitment specifically around regional inequality and social mobility is really powerful. Of course, now our job is to address Jack's point of making sure that we don't just get suckered into focusing on the engineering solution, but we really think about the equitable application of those engineering solutions across all of our transport networks.
Brilliant, Sarah, and it is very refreshing. We can talk about this now, it's true. So that's a very helpful update and a reminder about the way that the current government is looking at this. And Nick, that makes me want to come to you. And really what Sarah's describing is very much also a systems approach. We haven't used that phrase necessarily, but we often, when we're talking about transport, fall into the trap of thinking about those specific modes, road, rail, and so forth. But we know from an engineering perspective that that whole systems thinking is so important if we really want to understand how to create effective, sustainable change with the desired impacts as outcomes. This is something I know that you're very interested in. What can we do to make sure that that thinking becomes the norm in terms of how we tackle transport, whether that's on the policy side or on the engineering side?
Well, it's a really, really important point because the whole business of making a journey is inevitably complicated. And even if you just walk out of your house and get into a car, you're actually already involving a number of systems just in that process. And if you're using something like public transport, you're going to be using a lot of systems, and they do need to be able to fit together. And if we design them in a way that doesn't fit together, then it will make that so much more complicated. And I think I would bring into that actually a little bit of what Sarah was talking about, the if you like, the might call it the pleasure or the excitement of using a transport system that is well designed and able to work. Recently, I was talking with Chinese systems thinkers in design of railway vehicles, and they were saying they have just brought in a whole stream of humanities people, anthropologists, cultural scientists, people like that, because they realize in their massively fast development from the 1980s, when they were basically a rural economy, to now, that's 40 years, they have massively moved forward on that. But what they now have are Chinese-built German and Japanese trains. And what they're saying is they want a Chinese train. So what is a Chinese train? And it's such a fascinating question. And you realize then your systems thinking is now involving the people. Who are Chinese people? What are their characteristics that you would then have inside a train, and how do you represent that in something which on the face of it is a long thin thing? You're pretty limited in what you can do with a train, but how do you make it Chinese? And it's such a fascinating question, so I'm really excited about working with them on that kind of question. And that means that it's bringing the systems thinking outside engineering and incorporating the systems thinking, the kind of things that Jack is talking about. They are part of this system. And I think we need to make sure that engineers don't just think that there's a big box around engineering and inside it is called systems thinking, and we think we're very clever and we're doing it. Actually, the whole world is a system. And that's what we're trying to bring together by understanding the biology and the psychology, as well as the nuts and bolts and whatever of the engineering side. And I think the opportunities are phenomenal if we go for it.
Thank you, Nick. Exciting idea indeed. And one thing I can't help commenting on is that all three of you in different ways are actually people who embrace interdisciplinarity and kind of straddle cultures, both in your personal life and your professional life, whether that's because in your work there are human factors as inherently looking and connecting into different disciplines or because of your musical interests. You know, I'm interested to know what we can do to make this not something that depends on individual interests and specialization, but rather the culture and the norm in terms of how we work together to ensure that engineering and technology are underpinning positive social change. So what would you like to see happen in terms of the way we train, for example, future engineers or indeed future social scientists, Jack? I'm just really interested in your thoughts on this. Maybe I'll start with you, Jack.
Thank you. I mean, it's such an important question. I mean, one of the things that we've been doing at UCL recently, my team and I, we've been getting much more involved in training of engineering and physical sciences students, teaching them, not really teaching them, sort of enabling, empowering them to talk about what we call responsible innovation, right? Which are all of the things that maybe if you do a natural sciences or engineering education, particularly in our rather narrow British system, the things that sometimes sort of get beaten out of you because you're told to specialize. And sometimes you might not feel able to, or encouraged to, or incentivized to ask those bigger sort of questions. I mean, I took from Nick's previous comment that those questions are part of what it means to be an engineer, right? But inevitably, all of us, we have to specialize, which means that we choose, to ask some questions and not others. I mean, the example, this is at the risk of taking us down a rabbit hole. I got totally obsessed working on the sociology of self-driving vehicles with the highway code because of a suggestion that self-driving vehicles might need us to digitize the highway code. And the highway code is a fantastically interesting social device, which was designed so that it precisely wasn't black and white, right? It was a gray area. It was a code of good manners, I think was the phrase that the original transport secretary used in the 1930s. And these ideas, are part of the system of transport. They're part of how we teach children to cross the road. They are part of how I mean, you could call it engineer, but you could call it, I think, better to call it, cultivate mobile societies in particular places. Changes to those things need to be done very, very thoughtfully. And I think, I mean, I might be able to contribute some things as a social scientist, but engineers are, totally vital in that conversation, as are infrastructure planners and all the rest.
Great example, Jack. I'm going to go away and relook at my highway code. I probably shouldn't say that live on LinkedIn. Obviously, I'm deeply familiar with it from a rules point of view. Nick, do you want to riff off that?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Jack. That's really, really, really very interesting. I think the education of engineers is a massive problem right now because of exactly what Jack is talking about. That sort of, and the trouble is that the pipeline into the university is delivering people who are already entrenched in some way of thinking. And they have been gradually been entrenched in that from the age of 10 or 12 or something like that. And so I think we need to look at the pipeline into engineering. At the moment, it's far too, dare I say it, too sort of middle class, well educated, down a particular sort of line of thinking. Even if you go into Asia, into Europe, you'll see the same kind of thing. The people who are coming through are very like the ones that they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. And that's what's coming in. And we are in a bit of a habit of just making them more so. And I think when we start to take them apart and start to open out the ways of thinking, introducing arts and humanities into engineering, introducing philosophy into engineering is hugely important to get them to think in a different way about how they're going to apply and ask different engineering questions, solve different problems, work out much more what the problem really is, not just simply accept what you're given as a problem. And that is something which I think we need to, is a really urgent thing for engineering to think about. And transport is a very, very good example of that, because transport absolutely hits the social side because it's moving people around or things for people. and it's affecting people very, very strongly in ways that some kinds of engineering doesn't do so much.
Thank you, Nick. I'm going to get on to audience questions very soon, I promise. But Sarah, what's your take on this topic before I move on?
So I wholeheartedly agree with the points that Nick and Jack have said, but another element that I would throw in the mix is critical thinking and critical thinking skills. I'm really excited by the Engineers 2030 work that's happening, obviously led by the Royal Academy of Engineering, taking a look at our engineering degrees. We do have a challenge because we need to introduce these new skills such as critical thinking, being able to communicate clearly in both written and quantitative forms is a really important skill as well. But rules of physics still apply. We do still need to teach the fundamentals of mechanical, civil, electrical engineering, chemical, environmental as well. So we need to work out something's got to give here. And the other thing I think we also need to really sort of recognise is that the students that are coming through our education system now are ones that have had their education disrupted. And that's going to be the situation for probably the next decade as well. So recognising that actually we need to work with that student community and eventually that graduate community in helping them to develop the skills that perhaps there hasn't been time to focus on during their disrupted education is going to be really important. I think we really need to recognise the role of employers here. Engineering has been historically blessed with absolutely brilliant graduate schemes. Thinking about what's within those graduate schemes, thinking about how we support those graduate schemes to do that extra development that we know is actually where the real sort of nuggets of becoming a sort of hands-on engineer develop, that experience of being in the railway control room, being in the aircraft cockpit, working in a maintenance environment. They're the things that really teach you about engineering. And so thinking about how we support that progress into an engineering career, I think, is something else that we really need to be thinking about.
Thank you, Sarah. And as you've all indicated, a hugely important topic that the Academy is working on with its partners across the profession through the National Engineering Policy Centre. So more on that in due course. But I promised we would get on to audience questions, and I will now get on to audience questions. So first question is from Chandrima, who's asking about whether self-driving buses on dedicated lanes, which sounds very attractive as a concept, actually works from an efficiency point of view. So I've sort of taken this as the sustainability point of view as well as the efficiency from a passenger point of view. So Jack, I think I'll turn to you and love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So anybody that knows about transport knows that self-driving vehicles are to an extent already with us and have been for decades, particularly in London. We have the Victoria Line, the Docklands Light Railway, which are to an extent driverless. The thing you realize, looking at the current sort of excitement about self-driving vehicles in the idealized sort of autonomous vehicle is that the idea of autonomy is a myth. These things always depend upon others, right? They are not as fiercely independent as the Elon Musks of this world would have us believe. Infrastructures matter, and if you want to, for example, assure the safety and the efficiency of these systems, you think, okay, well, what sort of domain will these things operate in that means that we can rely upon them and mean that they won't encounter the sorts of uncertain circumstances that challenge their AI systems and all the rest of it. And when you sort of work through the engineering of that, and you end up with potentially some systems that look quite like the Docklands Light Railway, the sort of self-driving vehicles operating safely in particular highly constrained domains. And then you have exactly the questions of efficiency that Chandrima is pointing to. Ultimately, the choices and the trade-offs never go away, right? There are no magic bullets that come along and remove all of these difficult choices, which is why we have to get real about the social and the engineering reality of these new technologies.
Thank you very much, Jack. And I would like to come back to this question about choices and trade-offs, but I'm going to let Sarah come in off the back of your comments. But maybe you could also, Sarah, touch on Chandrima's second question around not just the move to electrification and renewable energy powering that electrification, but actually the riding experience for users as well and how that will change. So I'll hand to you.
Yes, so I mean, first of all, it's really interesting when we consider almost the trade-off or the different choices between a fixed rail, like a light rail system. I live in Nottingham, we have a light rail system at the end of my road. It has transformed the area that I live in, and it's a really sort of different experience to our very, very high quality bus network and travelling in the car. We know that there absolutely is an option for autonomous vehicles on sort of fixed guided pathways, basically painting the roadway to indicate the route of the self-driving vehicle. And there absolutely are some really good technical arguments as to why a sort of self-driving vehicle on a painted roadway would be a sensible and pragmatic alternative to the quite costly installation of a light rail system. But we mustn't be naive about the impact that light rail has on the economic confidence of an area. And actually, the UK has the fewest cities for its population of any country in Europe that have dedicated light rail systems. I think that's something that we really need as sort of sociologists to help us understand. Why is it that this fixed infrastructure gives so much confidence to investors and to the public about an area in a different way than some of the understandably perceived as more transient solutions might give? But Chandrima's come up with a really interesting sort of second point about we're changing the engineering of our transport systems. Well, what does that change in terms of the experience? I'm reminded of my mum was a big fan of the railways and used to talk about in romantic tones the steam railway experience. And of course, we saw a change when we moved from steam railways to diesel and electrified railways, and most of them quite pleasant changes in terms of the soot, the pollution that was caused by those railways, albeit perhaps with a loss of the perceived beauty. There was a really outstanding piece of work that was done by some of my colleagues at the Department of Transport called the Great Self-Driving Exploration. And what this did was this took new forms of transport, in this case autonomous transport, to 3 different locations in the UK, to Alnwick, to Taunton and to Manchester. Gave people the chance to experience that transport, and actually some of Nick's colleagues at UCL also helped us with that research by looking at electroencephalograms, so measuring the brain activity to look at how people responded to their experience of travelling autonomously. And they did find that at first people were a little bit anxious, maybe excited. That first corner that the vehicle took was one where you could actually see the brainwave activity increase a little bit. But very quickly it settled. And my favourite quote, that if any of you have heard me talk about this before will know what I'm about to say, was that one of the participants said that the experience was reassuringly boring. So actually, perhaps one of the things we want to do is to make some of these transitions invisible, because we know that people are comfortable with the way in which transport's designed now. But I do want to recognise Jack's point, which is maybe we actually need to be actively disruptive if we are very, very dramatically changing the way in which we're delivering our transport systems. So I think, yes, there will be a new riding experience, but we also need to think about whether people want a new riding experience or whether they actually are comfortable with their experience they have now.
Really great points, and what a good case study. I'll go and look that up options as well once I've reread my Haria code. Can I also just, while we're with you, Sarah, really quickly ask you to comment on Cormac's question around the relative effectiveness of different types of interventions, so in particular car scrappage schemes, rather than grants and incentives to drive adoption of electric cars, essentially. So that must be something that you and your colleagues spend some time thinking about. I'm sure Jack and Nick, you have thoughts too. And I'll come to you, Nick, just to give you an opportunity to comment on the kind of answers that Jack and Sarah have been giving in a minute. But anything you'd like to add on that, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, one of the joys of being the chief scientific advisor is I get to work with very experienced policy colleagues who understand much more than I do about the mechanics of things like scrappage schemes versus, of course, what we used to have, which were incentives to purchase new electric vehicles. And those have generally been tailed out. And car scrappage schemes are one of the policy initiatives that have been mooted as something that could potentially accelerate the adoption. This is where we need really, really strong social science to help us understand what the blockers are. So if the blocker is that people do not feel able to commit the funding to the purchase of an electric vehicle, and a car scrappage scheme is something that can actually incentivise that, then that would be a really good solution. But we do need to think about the whole life cost implications of removing existing, albeit carbon emitting vehicles from our roads. There is a really important piece of analysis that is repeatedly done to look at that balance between the whole life cost of continuing to use your carbon emitting vehicle on the road now versus purchasing a new vehicle, which, whilst not carbon emitting whilst in use, will have some carbon cost in its production. So there is a quite subtle balance that needs to be done there. I think that without going back to the analysis, car scrappage schemes, particularly for older vehicles, and particularly in areas where we know that the blocker is the ability to purchase or to move into a sort of rental agreement of a new vehicle. But one of the things that we do here is also a blocker is the charge point infrastructure. And so that's why at the moment, much of the funding has been focused on charging infrastructure. And then we can move on to the car scrappage solutions as one of the other things to consider.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's interesting, what we're keep on coming back to in the course of this discussion is this issue over choices and trade-offs, and you know, looking at transport and the fact that benefits can be as diverse as impacts on public health through to economic impact, through to impacts on you know, people's social lives, the environment, and on the other hand, looking at the various merits of the interventions on offer. You end up with this very complex system, as we have already talked about. And I'm wondering if, Nick, you can share some thoughts on how do we make this complexity tractable? So how can we get better at ensuring that we are looking at those benefits and risks over the right timescales, for example, and considering all the different groups that might be impacted? You talked at the start about, you know, the potentially disruptive approach of saying, when you look at the transport system, you need to think about the impact for citizens rather than the impact for the people that run the transport system. So how can we make this more tractable? Do we have the right tools?
I think we do, but I think they don't necessarily live in engineering. I think understanding communities a lot better would be a jolly good start. How do people come together? How do they mingle? How do they converse? How do they socialize? Those sorts of things. The sort of anthropological work done on that historically, I think, has been really, really powerful. And that then talks about how those communities then come together and where the transport system fits into that. And that gives you the kind of incentives that make how we do the transport different. So what size bus should you have? What size train? And Sarah quite rightly talked about the effect of light rail as a kind of confidence giver of permanence, if you like, or continued existence of an area. And I think that is a really, really important aspect, that people need the confidence to know that they are in a place, that they're in a variety of places that will continue, and they're not going to fall apart, and they're not going to disappear. And that is about that confidence giving piece. And some of that is around understanding how people actually think, how they make their decisions into the longer term, how they conceive themselves with other people, and also, and therefore, what the engineering is that's going to support all that. And so it's I think that's why I think that to me the complex systems picture is much more organic. And I do wonder whether, I mean, I have toyed around this because I see some real sort of barriers to this, but I do wonder whether we're kind of stuck with von Neumann's binary architecture for data. And we talk about digital, but people are not digital. And I'm often wondering whether actually we ought to be trying to configure and think about data as a more organic thing that is able to flex a lot more, able to reveal a lot more. But of course, that's a very, very long-term way of looking forward as to how we actually, what that's about is how do you actually get a better interface between people and the system. The autonomous vehicle, we have a driving simulator in the lab, which is specifically looking at the handover from the autonomous vehicle to the driver when the autonomous vehicle gives up, right, for whatever reason. And I think in 3 years, nobody has actually managed that transition without crashing the car. And part of that, I think, is that the way in which the vehicle is being driven and the kind of atmosphere around the way it's being driven is very heavily digital, but the person is actually being very much more biological. And I'm wondering whether that interface is something we need to be looking at in order to be able to get that interface between, at the larger scale than that, the people and the machine. How does that actually come together? And getting that right is perhaps the most complex part of the complex system.
That's a really fascinating angle. I feel like that merits a whole event in itself to explore it properly. But I'm going to keep going just because I want to try and make sure we get through the audience questions. So thank you for that, Nick. Big question from Natasha around what do we think is going to happen to international air travel, or rather I should say international travel. I'm prejudging the answer here. And I'm going to ask you, Sarah, because of course with your role you must be thinking about this, but Jack, I'd be interested in any thoughts you have as well from a more social science perspective. So I'll go to Sarah first and then come to you, Jack.
Yeah, it's a great question. And whenever I'm in an event like this, I always at the end think, oh, golly, I didn't mention that mode enough, or I didn't mention that aspect enough. So thank you, Natasha, for reminding us to broaden our horizons. Of course, we talk about international travel, but so much transport is also around freight. By volume, 95% of freight that arrives in the UK actually comes by ship. Although by value, I think it's 50% comes by aviation. So both of those modes are absolutely critical for the freight and logistics operations that we all take for granted, actually, within the UK. To be honest, it's one of those sort of wicked problems, a bit of a moral dilemma, the challenge of international travel. Of course, flying less will result in less carbon being directly emitted by fuels from aircraft. Similarly, using ships less will result in less fuels being emitted by boats, and actually critically, when we're thinking about port operations, improve the air quality around port side. But we know that not only do the industries of aerospace and freight bring economic value to the UK, but the experience of international travel is something that we as humans enjoy and value, whether it's for work or for leisure. I mentioned I live in Nottingham. Derby is home to Rolls-Royce, one of the major employers in the UK, not just through its own organisation, but all of the supply chain that surrounds it. And in an area that has quite significant social deprivation in some areas, the impact of Rolls-Royce is absolutely critical to the local and the national economy. So there's just a real balance here in terms of responsible international travel. I think one of the things we can do is have really honest and open conversations about the alternatives that are available to us. And I'm afraid I've got some more reading for you, Harrison. So earlier this week, our colleagues at Cambridge University published an outstanding report through their Aviation Impact Accelerator that looked at some of the systems challenges that we need to address when it comes to decarbonisation of aviation. And they really recognise the complexity of this, that it's not just about future fuels, primarily sustainable aviation fuel, but also other alternatives. It's also about making sure that the engineering solutions that we have already are working at absolute maximum efficiency. And we're thinking about the air travel as a whole, so management of the impact of contrails. So I think I'm going to have a sort of almost a sitting on the fence answer, which is I think it would be naive of us to say, no, we can stop having international travel. But let's think about what the responsible framework for international travel is, both in terms of its impact on the environment, but also that wider economic and societal consideration.
Brilliant, Sarah. I'm going to move into relatively quick fire mode here because we've got quite a few questions. I'd like to get as many covered off. So, Jack, if you want to add your thoughts on international travel, please do. And we've also got a question about the sustainability of electric vehicles and more generally how we ensure we're capturing embedded carbon and the true sustainability credentials of the various vehicles involved, the various modes of transport involved. So if you've got any thoughts on that, please do add it in.
Yeah, I've got very little to offer on the air travel thing, other than just, if I may just add a sort of just a note to Nick and Sarah's comments and talk about complex systems a little bit. So I think for people interested in observing complex systems, there's a danger that talking about complex systems, you sort of get into a mode of fatalism, right? Which is to say, oh, well, stuff happens. For policymakers, for innovators, that might be rather disabling. So I think maybe there's something about conceiving of these things as sort of social experiments that can be tweaked or steered, modulated towards different ends. And I think there's still a huge amount that the transport world, that we all have still to learn from COVID, which was the most extraordinary natural experiment, right? The most extraordinary disruption to mobility, as well as air travel. I mean, my sort of Pollyanna-ish hope would be that COVID made us think a little bit more deliberately about the necessity of especially the boring sorts of air travel that we do as part of our work, right? I totally recognize Sarah's point about the joy of international travel, but the sort of joyless travel that we, I think, all got into the habit of doing. Hopefully some of those habitual aspects have become a bit more deliberate. The other, I think, really interesting set of experiments that was happening there was around low traffic neighborhoods, right? Where actually, inventive experimental policymakers used the pandemic as an opportunity to try some stuff out, that would have been politically really, really hard to do in normal times. I think we still haven't quite learnt what worked both in engineering, infrastructure, and social science terms there. But I would say that, understanding the potential for experiment and hopefully the confidence that some policymakers got from what worked well around those things, I think is the other part of that, which doesn't help at all with the air travel conversation. Apologies.
Thank you, Jack. Well, let me quickly give Sarah the chance to come back on the sustainability questions. I think there are two questions about that. It's important, but if we can keep the answer tight, because I would like to just give everyone after that one opportunity to leave the audience with one optimistic aspiration that you have for how 10 years on, when we're having this conversation, things will be different. So Sarah, I'll let you ponder that whilst also answering the sustainability question.
Yeah, great. So I think there are a couple of questions around embodied emissions and also rare earth minerals that have come up, and they're really, really pertinent questions. In terms of rare earth minerals, absolutely, we need to be very, very conscious of their role in battery technologies, which are, of course, core to the transition to electric vehicles. There are two things that we can think about there: alternative battery solutions and recycling. I know that Patrick Vallance would not mind me saying publicly that he is really keen that we can do as much thinking as possible about battery recycling. And it's an area that certainly I think is one that sort of vexes him. And it's a little bit of a sort of tricky engineering problem, both in terms of the sort of value chain, but just technically in terms of that extraction. I know that the Royal Academy of Engineering has a report that's coming very soon on rare earth minerals that will be really important. I think I already answered the point around embodied emissions. And just to say, yes, it's absolutely critical that we think about everything that is consumed when we are producing vehicles, both in terms of the production process and the materials used.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I'm going to give you a minute to think about your positive vision for how this conversation will be different 10 years on. And I'm going to go to Nick first for his.
Okay, I can be very simple and quick. 10 years on, I would like to see the transport system absolutely accessible and available equitably to everyone. I think that, to me, is a massive challenge, but I think it's crucially important for society in the future.
Brilliant. No one's going to argue with that, Nick. Thank you. Jack, what about you?
So this is going to be really annoying if you're Sarah and you work at the Department for Transport. But I mean, my observation would be that a lot of the things that will have most impact upon transport may not be called transport policy, right? Like any area of when you're dealing with these complex systems, transport policy is also climate policy, it's public health policy, it's planning policy, all of these things which come together and interact. So in 10 years' time, I would like to see, you know, we've talked about it for decades, but genuinely joined up government so that these policies can realize their orthogonal benefits, not just doing what they set out to achieve. But I think the actual transformations will come from these other areas as well.
Well, it's always more fun from the audience when we have some disagreement, but despite your valiant effort, I'm not sure Sarah is going to disagree with that, but I'm going to hand to Sarah for the last word. Thank you so much, Jack.
I'm not going to disagree, but I'm going to build on Nick's point, actually. So Nick talked about accessible transport. I'm going to talk about equitable transport. I think in 10 years' time, it would be brilliant if no matter where you lived in the UK, you saw yourself as having a choice about the mode that you could use to travel. Whether it's for local journeys, national journeys, or international journeys.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all so much for a really stimulating discussion that ended on a lovely positive note. An hour is never long enough to do justice to topics like this, but we did a great job. Thank you so much. You did a great job, really, of taking us through some of the really important issues that underpin this headline topic of mobility and the connection with the transition to net zero and beyond. So I'd also like to thank our brilliant audience, everyone who joined online. Thank you so much. Thank you to those who submitted your insightful questions that made the panel work hard, always makes me happy. The conversations today, as I said at the start, are part of a wider programme of work. They're going to feed into our project through which we're creating dialogue between engineers and members of the communities that they live and work in order to make sure that we find those ways to support the transition to net zero, so that it does deliver this equitable, accessible version of the future that our panelists have just been discussing. If this conversation has sparked your interest in that project, or if you have further comments about today's event, please do respond to the survey that should have been posted in the chat or will be posted shortly, and will also be emailed to you following the event, because your feedback helps us to shape and improve future events. The next and final event in this mini-series is Built Environment, Visions for Greener, Healthier Buildings, and it's going to take place on the 7th of November at 1 p.m. There should be a link to register in the chat below right now. So please do stay tuned for updates on the next critical conversations via our LinkedIn page, and you can also catch up on previous critical conversations via the link in the chat below as well. But for now, thank you to all our panelists, thanks to everyone who joined us, and I hope you have a great evening, everybody. Thank you again.